Thank you. It's so nice to be here today. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone speaking. And also there's a lot of different things that I wanted to speak about, so I'm actually going to read this out as a paper. So, yeah, I hope that will be okay. So the way I continue to work with clay first began with a question, a big practical question. How and should I continue to work with clay in the aftermath of bankruptcy? It wasn't a quiet, slow thought. It was an urgent question shortly after graduating. I'd taken a bank loan to study for an MA and couldn't afford to repay it on top of the cost of living, never mind renting a studio space or buying equipment and consuming materials. There was a sense of beginning again from zero, and with it also came a sense of freedom. What was I unwilling to compromise? What did I need to protect? And for me, the answer to that was clay and the choice to make what interested me most. By working directly on site with raw material that I could then recycle, I was able to continue to do so. Looking back, that choice of how to continue 13 years ago was essentially about pursuing questions and not outcomes. Preparing for this talk, I tried to write down my questions and realized I have a lot. They overlap, they recur, they may be a dead end, one might obscure another, and inevitably they multiply within every project. So today I'll focus on 3 key areas of questioning that are ongoing within my work and how I've attempted to address them through my practice and future directions. The first area I want to consider relates to performance, and for some time I've been concerned with the question, how can objects and materials enact their own performance? It's fair to say that materials do this whether we like it or not, and my fascination with clay is precisely the way it changes and transforms, perhaps more visibly and radically than many other materials. It is an active agent, so why is that appealing and what does it offer? I think Martina Margetts captures this in her essay, The Matter in Hand, in Material Perceptions, when she writes, both the natural world and the human body constitute what I would call thinking matter. Earth, fire, water, and air are the first elements of material making and benchmark the flux of order and disorder prevalent in humans and in everyday life. This question of objects enacting their own performance was the focus of a fellowship I undertook at Camden Arts Centre in 2012 to 13. I'd been making ephemeral work for some years, but often the pieces themselves were relatively still during the period they were shown, and there were only a few instances where the pieces themselves had been more noticeably active. So one such piece was this work, Below, made underwater, during a short residency in 2007, and the work, a hand-rolled carpet of clay, gradually dissolved over a period of 1 month, sinking into the silt. These works also made at the Jerwood in London in 2011, where I began putting clay in contained environments which operated like microclimates for landscapes, encouraging condensation and erosion of the clay forms. There has, of course, always been a relationship to performance in the act of making on site and the specific duration of the work I made. But at Camden, I focused on how materials might combine and react with one another and the effects of exposure to human or environmental changes. As Petra Lange-Berndt describes in her introduction in the book Materiality, to understand the languages that emanate from materials or the atmospheres connected to them, one especially needs to consider what happens after the work of the artist is done, once materials are submitted to the forces of time, gravity, and the elements. This piece was built into a crack in the path outside the gallery at Camden, which kept opening up due to the fact that the ground beneath is also clay. And during the fellowship, I was also interested in extending my understanding of clay as a material, and spent time interviewing specialists in material science and geology, considering in particular the use of clay in ceramic structures for radioactive waste management in the material science department at Imperial College, and also understanding research into Martian clay undertaken by a specialist at the Natural History Museum as part of the Mars rover research. I also looked at paleobotany and specifically fossil plants identified in the London clay. The physical connection through clay to the prehistoric landscape in which it was formed is an ongoing interest and is part of a layered investigation of time. I'm interested how material specialism can encourage interdisciplinarity and the depth of knowledge of a single material opens up a diverse range of disciplines with something to offer one another. This collaborative piece made at Camden was presented at the end of the fellowship for a single evening where it was lit alongside an archive of research which viewers had to explore with a torch. The physical conditions of presentation demanded the viewer be active in looking and uncovering the archive, and how the viewer comes into contact or is immersed in an experience of the work is of ongoing importance. For example, at the University of Hawaii Art Gallery, where the viewer walked beneath a suspended structure covered in 2 tons of raw material, enabled a different perspective than is often given of working clay, which is so often grounded or experienced face to face. Similarly, this work made for the British Ceramics Biennial in 2013 required the audience to physically enter the environment of the work. The clay was palpable in the air as well as present as physical recognizable formations. The work itself was a complete environment. Within this more recent project at the University of Liverpool, the audience was invited to contribute to making the work. It was a commission in the former Women's Common Room in the original university building, which is now a gallery space. This room was the first dedicated space for women in higher education in the UK, and what remains from that time is a fireplace designed and carved by the first group of female students. The work I made, added to by the public, aimed to reimagine the space again as a common room and a place of shared making. And I've continued thinking about the performative object in recent work and sought to address this question directly in the piece I made, Triumph of the Immaterial, at the Victoria and Albert Museum as part of the Women's Hour Craft Prize in 2017. This piece developed from thinking about a group of fragments which I encountered during a residency at the V&A in 2010. They're a collection of porcelain pieces belonging to table fountains produced by Meissen in the 18th century. And since the residency, there was an intensive research and conservation project within the museum to reconstruct one of the original table fountains, which is now on display in the European galleries. This object was made for the occasion of a royal wedding and would have been experienced as part of the dessert course, and depicts the triumph of Amphitrite, a sea nymph and wife of Neptune in classic mythology. So the work I made, Triumph of the Immaterial, was a fountain produced entirely from clay that ran with water for a few minutes each day, gradually eroding itself over the course of a 6-month exhibition. Like the original Meissen fountain, there is an interest in the embodied multi-sensory experience of an object. And this project also confronted my next area of questioning regarding documenting and collecting the ephemeral. How can we meaningfully document and record ephemeral work with clay? And how best can such work be represented within the permanence of museum collections? This exhibition was required to tour to subsequent venues, so in this instance I fired fragments collected from the work shown alongside a photograph and film. For me, this is a challenging area and one that I am both invested in personally within my practice and also as a ceramics research centre at the University of Westminster, where we are looking at this area together with the V&A in our research. Ephemerality is inherent to the work I make, and whilst I'm not interested in holding on to the object itself, I am aware that if such works are not recorded or do not leave behind some form of trace within museum collections, it quickly becomes absent from future art history, and there exists a gap between what has taken place and what is represented in collections for the future. Much work has been done over the past decade around collecting performance, and Tate has led extensive research in this area. However, practices such as my own, in which the objects are not explicitly produced as performance, do not tend to be captured by collections with this objective, and largely museum collecting strategies are still geared towards the acquisition of physical objects. There are challenges around the combination of material specificity and ephemerality, particularly where practice is also rooted in craft and the hand of the maker may be of particular significance. As with performance, there is a more complex negotiation and transaction that needs to take place in order for such work to enter collections, beyond the tradition of straightforward purchase and acquisition. Curator Rose Lejeune, who is currently completing a PhD at Goldsmith, which examines collecting the ephemeral in both public and private contexts, describes: For me, one of the things that is exciting about performance, but what makes it very different to other kinds of practice, is that each piece is different. And by that I mean, of course, every painting is different aesthetically, but most people know how to ship them, store them, display them, sell and resale and circulate them in the traditional ways. With each performance, it requires a different package around it. It will have different requirements with objects photography and the documentation, as well as questions surrounding moral and legal rights. As this will be different for every performance, it means you need to think about these points every single time. I think there is a perception that these things are no longer an issue because they are so present across contemporary practice, but my experience has been that actually it is still an avoided area. And when museum budgets and curator time are already under immense pressure, there is a reluctance perhaps to take on that burden. At the same time, museums have often encouraged and instigated work that is ephemeral or performative in nature as part of public programs, events and learning, but it is rare that this is also recorded in the collection, and as such operates with a different status in the museum. I've worked with at least 10 museums through projects, often in response to collections. However, only one of those projects has been formally acquired. This was a project I made in 2015, commissioned through the Contemporary Art Society. And it was a version of a work I first made in 2011 at Siobhan Davies Dance Studios in London, where over the course of 3 days I worked directly onto a rope hoisting, that's the wrong slide. So this was the work. Working directly onto a rope, which was hoisted with a pulley as I made the work. So a version of this piece was then made at Southampton City Art Gallery in 2015. And the making of the work, the piece itself, and the final dissolving back to raw material was recorded through photographs and film. And this documentation entered the collections of 3 regional museums as a joint acquisition. The process of negotiating which work and the format of how it would be acquired and shared between institutions took over 2 years. And the project explored one method for addressing some of the issues. And what was apparent was the necessity for clarity on both the side of the artist and the museum. And a key aspect of that was in defining where the work lies and what exactly constitutes the work and where does it become a record or archive. I'm currently particularly concerned with how I document the work I make, which to date has largely been through photographs and sometimes film. And I have felt frustrated by how limited a record this provides, and I'm currently interested in what other forms of recording might provide a richer document of the work and better capture its essence, including both visual and non-visual media. I'm interested in the idea of multi-channel recording and how we might understand or reinterpret this as a methodology for documenting temporary sculpture, collecting together multiple traces of a work. For example, writing, painting, fragments, or a recreation of humidity even might play a role in recording or representing a work. Perhaps in combination they may produce a richer, more whole document of the original sculpture, but I am only beginning to test out these ideas through practice, and I'm aware that this may also require collaboration with other specialists, which adds further complexity if returning to the question of collecting. Whilst these questions so far mainly consider issues surrounding the nature of the work, each project of course also has specific questions in terms of themes and narratives it attempts to understand and uncover. So the third area I will talk about is a major ongoing question for me, which is how we might understand ceramics as a form of science fiction, both historically as well as within contemporary practice. And this was something I began thinking about during the residency at the V&A in 2010. And was looking at the representation of nature and landscape in historic ceramic objects in the collection, particularly transfer printed designs such as these. I became interested in the way after changes to the Copyright Act in the 19th century, scenes became increasingly fictional and styles are thrown together, plants are transferred to the wrong climates and locations. This fictional representation of nature is also prevalent in Rococo design, where the blending of human, animal, earth and mineral is commonplace. And to me, there is also a historic pairing of science and fiction in the manufacture of decorative objects with companies such as Meissen and Wedgwood, who invested heavily in developing materials and techniques involving scientific research, and then applied that material knowledge towards producing decorative objects that could also be understood as a form of fiction. Objects such as candlesticks begin to appear almost like a species, a form of fantastical growth. I've also been looking closely at these drawings by Jean-Baptiste Pierremont, who produced a large series of fantasy botanical studies in the 18th century. And though fictional, they remain botanically believable. And James Trilling considers this mutability in Rococo design in the language of ornament. And he writes, "The artist bombards us with impossibilities, fantastic creatures, masonry arches that bend like rubber, monuments half transformed into plants, feathers and unrecognizable shapes and substances. The conventional basis of the Rococo is mutability in all things. Instead of brushing away the inherent contradictions of ornament, we're encouraged to revel in them in their most radical form." So this all fed into a project I worked on earlier this year at the Tetley Gallery in Leeds, where I created an immersive installation and also presented a research room, which shared the objects and written fiction that informed the work. So this is from the research room, and you can see a pair of 18th century candlesticks that reflect some of that sense of decorative science fiction. And there's also a collection of books, including writers such as J.G. Ballard, Ursula Le Guin, and H.P. Lovecraft. Specifically, 4 of the books include descriptions of colourless places, which is a recurring idea in science fiction, and of course present in much of the work I made from raw clay. Literary fiction has frequently informed my work, and to me there seems a direct link between clay as a medium and written language, essentially an infinite monochromatic substance from which we can imagine something as detailed and vivid as another world. For the installation, A Ripening Surveillance, I created an imagined landscape where plants had mutated to listen and gather information, in some ways not entirely fictional. Fake trees and rocks have a history of concealing listening devices, or sometimes even spies, which includes examples from World War I right up to the present day. And so too, botanical research has also proven how plants are capable of communication on some levels. The installation was made entirely in the gallery and was an ongoing process added to throughout the duration of the exhibition. Similar to the environment created for the previous piece after the death of the bear, a polythene enclosure was created with water sprayers timed to come on intermittently to maintain a high humidity. So while some areas dried, others remained wet for the entire time. And throughout, there were also the traces of the human process of making, fingerprints, fist marks, and footsteps imprinted into the raw material alongside more delicate botanical constructions resembling satellites and transmitters. This work was part of a group exhibition called Material Environments, which, through the work of 5 artists, explored how the gallery can be used as a live site for research, production, and performance. In focusing on my previous question around documenting and recording an ephemeral work, I'm currently looking how I gather the traces of this piece and will represent them within an exhibition next March. And I'm working to try and capture this work through writing, which will be presented within a constructed reading environment. I also recently incorporated fragments salvaged from the work into a new piece seen here. And for me, this was again about thinking about rewriting elements of a work, traces and what is carried forward or disappears. Within every project, there is multiplicity in the questions it asks, the histories it draws upon, and the narratives it creates. Where there can be a pressure to reduce things to a single idea, a search for a single answer, or a single way of doing things. And often when my work is talked or written about, there is a desire to write a single narrative, to summarize in a linear way one kind of work. I am, however, interested in embracing complexity and multiplicity in meanings and process. And Ursula Le Guin writes wonderfully in her essay, A Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, about gathering as an anthropological beginning of rewriting traditional narratives and as the form of fiction itself. And she writes, the proper fitting shape of the novel might be that of a sack, a bag. A book holds words, words hold things, they bear meanings. A novel is a medicine bundle holding things in a particular powerful relation to one another and to us. And when I came to write science fiction novels, I came lugging this great heavy sack of stuff, my carrier bag full of beginnings without ends, of initiations, of losses, of transformations, far fewer triumphs than snares and delusions, full of spaceships that get stuck, missions that fail, and people who don't understand. So I'll end on the thought that we might also understand clay as a carrier bag to lug, haul, carry, receive, share, and unload our questions.